started now. So good morning. Welcome to the Nakba and Palestinian refugees 75 years on, why they still matter. I'm Khalid Al-Gindi. I direct the program on Palestine and Palestinian Israeli affairs here at the Middle East Institute. So by way of context, just 2 days ago, March 15th, marked 75 years since the Nakba, which is Arabic for catastrophe, when roughly 750,000 Palestinians, some 2/3 of Palestine's Arab population at the time, were forced to flee their homes over the course of Israel's creation in 1948. Today, there are more than 8 million Palestinian refugees, including those displaced in 1948, as well as 1967, and at other moments, making them the largest and oldest unsettled refugee population in the world. The issue of Palestinian refugees was one of the core so-called permanent status issues during the Oslo peace process that was supposed to have been resolved a quarter century ago, but for various reasons, the refugee issue in particular has been pushed aside. Today, we're going to talk about the significance of the Nakba, including how the Palestinian refugee problem came about in the first place and why they still matter in the quest for a durable peace between Palestinians and Israelis. And to shed light on these and other issues, we've assembled a stellar panel of experts. I'll introduce them briefly here, but you can see their full bios on the event page for this event. So first, we have Leila Hilal, who is a human rights and conflict resolution expert, as well as a consulting advisor to the Carter Center. Next, we have Ahlam Muhtasib, who is professor of media studies at California State University in San Bernardino. And she's also a co-producer of the award-winning documentary 1948 Creation and Catastrophe, which of course deals with the very subject that we're talking about. Next, we have Josh Rubner, who is Director of Government Relations at the Institute for Middle East Understanding, the IMEU. And finally, we'll hear from Lubna Shomali, Advocacy Manager for Badil Resource Center for Palestinian Residency and Refugee Rights. She's ordinarily based in Palestine, but she's joining us, I think, from the West Bank. I'm sorry, from New York. And special thanks to Ahlam for joining us so early from the West Coast. So Ahlam, I want to, so actually just by way of format, I'll start the discussion off with some questions to each of our panelists. And then toward the end, we'll open it up to questions from our audience. Please submit your questions using the Q&A box at any time during the discussion. It's at the bottom of your Zoom window, and we'll try to get to as many of your questions as possible. So Ahlam, I'd like to start with you. It's generally understood that Israel was founded as a state in May 1948, following the end of the British mandate over Palestine, and that in the process, around 750,000 or so refugees fled the country. But there are key aspects of Israel's origin story that are generally not well known. Tell us about those events, in particular, the subject of your film, 1948, Creation and Catastrophe. How did the bulk of Palestine's refugees come to leave the country in the first place? And how did events begin? And maybe tell us a little bit about your film and how people can view it.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. And I would like to start by acknowledging that I'm joining you all from the indigenous, colonized, unceded lands of the Ahaloni Native Americans in what is called the Bay Area. And the question might take a lot of time, of course, to explain in details, but I will try to give a brief summary. So the the partition plan by the United Nations was a very unfair decision, on behalf of the United Nations, and one of the first actually resolutions that the United Nations issued. It happened because of a severe, lobbying by the United States government, the Truman government, actually in particular, where they put pressure on many countries to vote in a certain way, which is actually to support the partition plan. It was unfair because it gave more than 50% of the lands of historical Palestine to the Zionists at that time, when they were a minority. And they were actually a minority in the lands where they were given, with an Arab majority, Palestinian Arab majority. And at the same time, until 1948, Jews, Zionist Jews only owned no more than 7.5% of historical Palestine. So it was such grave injustice that the Palestinians rejected it, and they started resisting. Of course, they were not armed. They were not supported by superpowers like the Zionists, who were, armed and supported by the British, until, of course, the British decided to leave the mess and the mandate. And so at the end of the 1947, a lot of, fighting started. And actually, the Zionists were also fighting the British because they wanted them to leave faster. And this kept on escalating until, the peak in April, May of 1948. But it continued even after the declaration of the State of Israel. And it still continues until today. That's why we keep on saying the Nakba has not ended. We still live it every day. Theft of land, killing of Palestinians, etc. So the events were, basically there were several plans already prepared, even in 1947, including Plan Dalit by the Zionists. And those military plans or orders were very specific and very intentional, and also knew what they wanted to do in case the British, leave Palestine. And basically, they had a systematic plan of ethnic expulsion. I don't like the word ethnic cleansing, and I want to get into that now because it kind of has this kind of positive connotation. But anyway, let's call it ethnic expulsion or genocide. And that was a systematic process, basically, of going to Palestinian areas, to Palestinian villages, and kick the Arab Palestinian population out. And the evidence is massive in terms of how this was happened and how intentional it was. Of course, Zionists keep the narrative that it was not, that Palestinians somehow either fled on their own or they were lied to by their leaders, etc. But actually, the majority of evidence show that it was because of the violence inflicted on them by the Zionist militias. And the peak came, in Deir Yassin massacre in April 12 of 1948. And it was not necessarily the worst massacre in terms of how ugly and how terrible it was and how violent, but it was the worst in terms of how it was, employed and weaponized to instill fear in the rest of the Palestinian population, to expedite actually the flight. So most Palestinians either fled because they were so scared because they heard about the massacres and they were not armed, they didn't have a choice, or they actually kept on fighting until the last minute. And third, they were, expelled at gunpoint, by those militias. I just finished actually a review for a new book authored by a Palestinian Canadian, refugee author, Hmayed Ali. It's called Abandoned. And he talks about the village of Lubia in the Galilee, and he said, that people were so innovative in their forms of resistance. They went even to caves and hid during the night in the caves and came back, to work the land, and during the day kept on fighting back and forth until they reached a point where they were basically expelled. And that's how it happened. If you lived in the north, most likely you ended up in Lebanon or Syria, especially if it was, closer to the Syrian border. If you lived in the south, you were expelled actually to Gaza. That's why about 85% to 90% of people in Gaza actually are refugees. Or you ended up in Egypt, and many people ended up in Jordan. And of course, we have another wave in 1967. And the film is called 1948 Creation and Catastrophe. You can drop the link for people to look at it. It took over 10 years to release. It was a massive, massive project of research and filming in 7 countries, interviewing Israelis and Palestinians, and the majority of historians on the topic, the majority of authority historians on the topic.
Thank you, Aham. Lubna, I want to turn to you as someone who works on the refugee issue directly, not just those who fled in 1948, but more generally. You're familiar also with Israeli policy. So tell us a little bit about how did Israel respond to the refugee problem when it began, and what is its current stance toward Palestinian refugees? Have Israeli leaders ever accepted responsibility for the creation of the refugee problem? And also, I know I'm putting a lot into this question, what happened to the homes and other properties of Palestinian refugees who fled? And were those properties documented somewhere?
Thanks, Khalid. Thanks, Ahlam, for your great response. And it's a pleasure and an honor to be here with all of you. From the beginning, even despite the Zionist movement and Israel's propaganda that there is no Palestine, Palestinian refugees don't exist, the Palestinian people don't exist, the Zionist movement knew that Palestine was not a land without people. There were people in Palestine, and they identified as Palestinians. So, of course, the first phase was to get rid of as many Palestinians as possible. And Ilham talked about how they did that. The second phase, of course, would be to control the land, of all those Palestinians. As a result of Plan Dalet and several, about a dozen military plans that were implemented during the Nakba, from the period of 1947 to about 1949, 750,000 Palestinians became refugees, meaning they were displaced outside of the area that came to be called Israel, while another 40 to 60,000 were displaced internally. They became internally displaced persons. To deal with their properties, Israel created the absentee property law, which basically states that even though I, Israel, have forcibly displaced you from your homes, and even though I, Israel, prevent you from returning to your homes, I, Israel, declare you to be absent. And as an absentee, you forfeit all rights to your property, and your property comes under the custodianship of Israel. So the properties belonging to the 750,000 Palestinian refugees that were forcibly displaced from Palestine went into the custodianship that is controlled by Israel. They didn't stop there in terms of control of property. They also created what is known as the present absentee. And for that, that law basically states that even though I know you are here, you are still present, I'm still going to declare you absent and take your property, strip you of your property rights, and funnel them into the Israeli custodianship of absentee property. And they use that present absentee law to take the properties belonging to the 40 to 60,000 Palestinian internally displaced persons inside what came to be called Israel. Through the absentee property law and the present absentee clause, Israel took over 78% of mandatory Palestine. And that 78% are properties belonging to Palestinian refugees and IDPs. And they continue to this day to control these properties, all of them. Whether they belong to Palestinian refugees or internally displaced persons. They also created parallel military orders. So as they continue with the ongoing Nakba, the policies and practices put in place to continuously displace Palestinians out of Palestine. They continue to use the absentee property military order law and the present absentee property law and military order in order to continue to take illegal, obviously, control of those properties. Have they taken responsibility? No, of course not. One of the stipulations when Israel was recognized as a state, a nation state within the UN, was that they would recognize the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and they would grant both Palestinian refugees and IDPs, internally displaced persons, their right of return. And from the beginning, Israel knew that not only that they would have to displace Palestinians, but they would also have to keep them away. So the denial of Palestinian return is also a very foundational policy, or a very foundational component of the Israeli regime. The properties are also, there was of course, at that time, the UN created two bodies, the UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which was mandated to provide humanitarian aid and assistance to Palestinian refugees. And they also created the UNCCP, the United Nations Conciliation Commission on Palestine, which that agency's job was to coordinate and facilitate the right of return of Palestinian refugees and IDPs. Obviously, this agency did not do that, even though it still exists today, but it doesn't have any operational activities. But what it did do after the Nakba of 1948 is that they did create what was called the Palestinian files. And the Palestinian files have the vast majority of properties, both mobile and immobile, so land and other natural resources like wells and springs and so on and so forth, as well as mobile property that belonged to Palestinians. So there is some record, a very almost complete, not entirely complete, record of the losses of Palestinian refugees and IDPs from the period of the Nakba.
Thanks, Lubna. Leila, I want to turn to you. Lubna mentioned the responses by the UN, the creation of UNRWA, and so forth. So the Palestine crisis was one of the first to be taken up by the newly created United Nations, which was established just 3 years before then. How did the international community respond to the refugee crisis? And why has the situation of, in your view, why has the refugee problem been unresolved for so long?
Thank you, Khaled, and thanks to Middle East Institute for hosting and inviting me to participate. Lubna began to describe the UN regime that was created, but I would just step back and comment in response to your question that the UN really saw itself as both an instigator and a mediator of the refugee crisis, which was really understood as the bulk of the conflict at its origin in 1948. I mean, the UN had passed the partition plan, partitioning historic Palestine into a Jewish state and a Palestinian Arab state. And we now look at that partition plan as, let's say, a more progressive way of resolving the conflict, but at the time it was seen as a major provocation and colonial-oriented provocation. And it led to the war of 1948, where the Arab states began attacking Jewish militias and forces, and there was heightened efforts to displace Palestinians. So the partition plan of 181 is seen as really sort of leading to a sense of responsibility on the part of the UN to respond to the crisis in a way that would help resolve it. they established the UN Mediator Office, which launched with a Swedish diplomat conducting a survey and report, issuing a report of the situation and recommending that Palestinians be allowed to voluntarily return to their homes. And he was subsequently assassinated the day after the report was issued, which led to led to a subsequent establishment of different institutions. But his report informed the UN General Assembly Resolution 194, which continues to be sort of the seminal framework for thinking about how to resolve the refugee issue, and it called for the voluntary return of Palestinians to their homes. It also established the UN Conciliation Commission, which Lubna mentioned, and that commission was charged with mediating the conflict, including compensation for lost properties. UNRWA was established through separate resolution with a mandate to cover the humanitarian needs of the Palestinians. So the UN set up this special regime to address the refugee issue, and that regime, with the exception of the UNCCP, continues to sort of operate today in one form or the other. The question of why hasn't the refugee issue been resolved requires significant analysis. But I would say at the sort of dawn of the conflict around 1948 to 1950, when you had the special regime by the UN established, the situation, the context was not really conducive to the return of the refugees, because Israel's response was to establish this legal institutionalized regime, which would prevent the return and restitution of Palestinian properties, which Lubna described. The US, which I believe Josh is going to speak more to, was one of the members of the UN Conciliation Commission. It did not really seek to push Israel to respond to the rights of the refugees that was recognized by the UN. So quite early on, the US was in a position of aligning itself with Israeli interests. Another significant aspect that led to the early posturing of around resolution, where the Arab states were looking at the inevitability of resettlement of the refugees, and were seeking compensation as a priority in order to enable the resettlement to cover their costs in a way. But ultimately, I think the Palestinians were not afforded significant participation and influence in this diplomatic response early on, in order to prioritize their rights and interest in return. So that exclusion contributed to a stalemate that continues today, that I think we'll continue to talk about throughout the session.
Yeah, thanks for that reminder, Leila. I think a lot of people forget, or just simply are unaware, that at that particular moment, there wasn't really any sense of Palestinian agency. It was the entire conflict was seen as one between a nascent state of Israel and surrounding Arab states. The Palestinians were an unfortunate casualty of that conflict, or collateral damage, but they weren't really seen as actors in their own right in any political sense. Josh, I want to turn to you. We touched a little bit on the US role, and I know this is also the subject of your research. What was the US role in response to the events of 1948, both before Israel's establishment and after? during the refugee crisis as it unfolded.
Thanks. Thanks so much for inviting me to this webinar, Khaled, and thanks to the Middle East Institute, and thanks to all my esteemed colleagues. It's an honor to be on this panel with all of you. I think to answer that question, it's important to back up a step to talk a little bit more about the partition resolution and to recognize, yes, upfront, we need to say that this was a violation of the self-determination of the Palestinian people, a forcible partition of their country against their wishes. Stating that fact, we also have to recognize that the partition plan of 1947 was very different than the Peel partition recommendation of Great Britain in 1937, which mandated the forced expulsion of Palestinians from within the proposed Jewish state. The UN partition plan of 1947 did not envision compulsory forced transfer of populations. What the UN partition plan did, though, was not to establish a Palestinian Arab state and a Jewish state. In reality, the demographics of the partition plan called for the establishment of a Palestinian state, plus the establishment of a binational state, where Jewish Palestinians and Arab Palestinians were almost equalized within these borders. But the partition plan called for equal rights, and it called for the establishment of a constitution that would guarantee the property rights, the political rights, the cultural rights of the Palestinian population in the Jewish state and vice versa. So this is the plan that the United States thought it was voting for. And of course, it was never implemented because of Israel's expulsion of the Palestinian people, which took place well before the end of the British mandate. So I give this historical background to give a sense that there was no anticipation that there would be a Palestinian refugee crisis. This was not how it was supposed to play out, at least in terms of the eyes of the US policymakers and other countries that voted for partitioning Palestine. That being said, when the expulsions began in the spring of 1948, and even a little bit earlier, and especially in the summer of 1948, the United States became incredibly worried. The Secretary of State, George Marshall, sent out a circular memo to all US diplomatic posts in the region saying, we're hearing terrible reports of this Palestinian refugee crisis. Can you report back to Washington, D.C. and tell us what's going on? Now, the new US ambassador to Tel Aviv, James MacDonald, who by no stretch of the imagination could be considered remotely friendly to the Palestinian people. He was a, quote, professional Zionist in the words of the Undersecretary of State. James MacDonald, he wrote to George Marshall saying, this is a tragedy of catastrophic proportions. And he said that 100,000, at least 100,000 Palestinian refugees would die if dramatic steps weren't taken by the United States. Because the reality is that you had hundreds of thousands of Palestinians living out in the open without access to food, without access to water, without access to medical care or shelter. And the fall and the winter of 1948 were exceptionally brutal in terms of the weather in Palestine. And so because of this mounting humanitarian catastrophe, as US diplomats called it, the US actually did mobilize a very quick and very effective humanitarian response. This was even before UNRWA. It was called the UNRPR, UN Relief for Palestine Refugees, and it was headed by a US diplomat, Stanton Griffiths, who was the ambassador to Egypt. Undoubtedly, that action led by the United States saved many, many Palestinian refugee lives. But I think it's also important to talk about this, not just from a humanitarian standpoint, but from a political standpoint as well. It's forgotten today that the US not only voted for UN General Assembly Resolution 194, but actually helped lead the passage of this General Assembly resolution in 1948 that established and called for the right of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes. And the US was very against Israel's expropriation of Palestinian property. It demanded that Israel repatriate at the very minimum 250,000 Palestinian refugees. And President Truman himself said that he was, quote, rather disgusted by Israel's treatment of the Palestinian refugees and by Israel's refusal to allow them to return home. All this, the pro-Israel advocates of the world would like you to write out of the historical record. But this is the historical record. Now, why didn't the US follow through? I think this is a really important point to address as well. Even though the US said Israel must repatriate at least 250,000 Palestinian refugees, and the US exerted some sanctions on Israel to try to achieve that goal. So, for example, the US held up the provision of Export-Import Bank loans to Israel in 1949 in order to try to force Israel to repatriate Palestinian refugees, as was required by international law. Even though the United States took these steps, it's important to note that the Truman administration was not willing to expend the political capital that was necessary to actually reverse Israel's expulsion of the Palestinian people. So you had this rhetorical support for the Palestinian right of return, not backed up by strong enough action on the part of the United States. And this, I think, set the pattern for the next 75 years, where the US makes a policy pronouncement, says that Palestinian refugees should be allowed to return, says today that Israel should stop colonizing Palestinian land in the West Bank, but is unwilling to do anything about it. And it's a pattern that we need to break, because this pattern enables and makes the United States complicit in Israel's ongoing Nakba against the Palestinian people.
Thanks, Josh. I want to stick with you for a moment because you mentioned U.S. officials were completely aware of what was happening on the ground in real time all throughout this process, before and after May of 1948. And of course, all of these events have been well documented, not just by Palestinian historians, but even by Israeli historians and others. And yet, there is this, as you sort of alluded to, there is this impulse to deny these events, either explicitly, people openly say it never happened, it's simply a lie, or kind of more subtly by sort of downplaying the significance of this series of events. Both forms of this kind of denial are quite common here in Washington. We saw that last week with an event that you actually spoke at on Capitol Hill, in which Speaker McCarthy tried to prevent a Nakba commemoration from even happening on Capitol Hill. It was still convened in a different location. And then, of course, there was a decision by the Biden administration to skip the commemoration of the Nakba at the General Assembly, which was the first time I believe that has happened. And so there is this kind of subtle and explicit forms of denial. What does this denial come from? And why does it even matter if people acknowledge events that happened 75 years ago? And why can't they just sort of move on and deal with the realities as they exist today?
Yeah, those are critically important questions. And I think that we should de-exceptionalize Nakba denialism. And I think we should view the denial of the Nakba by those who would whitewash Israel's history in a similar way that we understand other examples of historical denialism. So the way I understand Nakba denialism is a very similar way to the way that Holocaust denialism operates, or the denialism of the genocide against the Armenian people. It's a very hideous, very insidious attempt at memoricide. In other words, it's a doubling of the crime, right? There's the commission of the crime and the atrocity in the first place. And then there's the attempt to gaslight the victims and the survivors by trying to convince the world that this crime or this atrocity never took place to begin with. So it operates in the same way, but this is a historical fact. The Nakba happened. And just to give you a few examples from the US archives about the details of US knowledge about the Nakba, I've found in the archives detailed lists with names, ages, and professions of every single Palestinian who was exiled from the village of Tarshiha in the north, not in 1948, but in 1949, after the armistice agreements were signed. Israel expelled all of these Palestinians from this village, and their names and details are documented in the US archives. I'll give you another example. In 1950, in Majdal, in the south, near the Gaza Strip, Israel expelled thousands of Palestinians. This was 2 years after 1948. In the records of the US archives, there are monthly totals of the numbers of Palestinians expelled from Majdal by Israel. So the Nakba is a historical fact. It's not up for debate. And to engage in debate about whether it happens only enables and strengthens those who attempt to deny this atrocity. And I think it's interesting that you mentioned Speaker McCarthy's act in trying to prevent the commemoration and education about the Nakba on Capitol Hill. I think it's very, very interesting and telling that in the United States, the very same political forces, the very same politicians who would ban books, who would ban discussions of critical race theory, who would ban discussions of the genocide of the indigenous people of North America, who would ban discussion of the enslavement of African Americans, and all of the other atrocities that the United States has committed, that these are the very same people who are trying to do the exact same thing with the history of the Palestinian people. And in both cases, this denialism of the atrocities the United States has committed and continues to commit in terms of the pervasive racism that is an aspect of our country today. In both of these examples, you are attempting to whitewash history. History is not there for us to like or not like. History is a fact. History is what occurred. So we don't have to feel good about the fact that these atrocities were committed in the past. And we shouldn't feel good about the fact that these atrocities were committed in the past. But that is all the more reason why we need to bring them to light, so that we can ensure that atrocities like this are not committed in the future, and also to understand the ongoing nature of the Nakba today, to understand that the catastrophe continues on a daily basis. And you know why Speaker of the House Kevin McCarthy tried to shut down this event? In addition, it was because Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib introduced a historic resolution not only to commemorate the Nakba and what happened in 1948, but to recognize that Israel's system of settler colonialism imposed on the Palestinian people today is an ongoing Nakba, and that the atrocities and the oppression continue today. So yes, there are forces in Congress that would prefer that we not talk about these realities, who would prefer that we whitewash the history of Israel. But we're here pushing back, and we have allies in Congress who are pushing back to make sure that the truth of the historical account comes out. And it's necessary, it's important, Khalid, because if we don't understand the past, if we don't understand how we got here today, we can't make prescriptions for the future. We can't establish a just and lasting peace without not only understanding the atrocities committed against the Palestinian people, but remedying them to the extent that we can as well.
Thanks, Josh. Lubna, I want to come back to you. We talked a little bit about UNRWA, the UN agency that provides services to the millions of Palestinian refugees. I know you're not a representative of UNRWA, and so I'm not asking you to speak on their behalf, but as someone who I'm sure works with UNRWA on a fairly regular basis, I'd like to tap into your expertise. So there are some other kind of myths and misunderstandings of the role that UNRWA plays. I mean, interestingly enough, UNRWA used to get bipartisan support in Congress, as well as support from the administration for decades, in large part because the US understood that it bore some responsibility for the creation of the refugee problem in the first place. And so that's why I think this is also part of the historical record. And that's why the US, for most of UNRWA's existence, was the largest single donor. But as you know, in recent years, UNRWA has come under attack, and there are quite aggressive campaigns to entirely defund and dismantle UNRWA. One of the arguments made against UNRWA is that it's obsolete and that it's only perpetuating the conflict, only perpetuating the refugee problem. If only UNRWA didn't exist, then the millions of Palestinian refugees who are registered as refugees would no longer be refugees. They would simply be settled and so forth. So what's behind these allegations? Tell us also a little bit about who is and who isn't legitimately considered a refugee. There's some misunderstanding out there that Palestinians have their own unique definition of refugees, that only Palestinians can pass on their refugee status to children and grandchildren. And then if you could, I know I'm overloading the question, but if you could tell us about the kinds of services that UNRWA actually provides on a day-to-day basis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll do my best. The problem is that Israel has always tried to make the Palestinian refugee issue the exception rather than the rule. And to a certain extent, they have succeeded at this. So to speak very specifically to the issue of refugee inheritance or the inheritance of refugee status, this is a standard principle under international law. The only way, according to international law, that your refugee or IDP status can be resolved is if you are provided with durable solutions, meaning that you are provided with the opportunity, the possibility to freely choose to return, voluntary physical repatriation. And if you don't want that, then you have to have the other two durable solutions, which is resettlement or integration. Palestinian refugees and internally displaced persons have never been given this opportunity, never been given this right as it belongs to them according to international law. And so because of this denial of the right of return, as long as there are those who are born to Palestinian refugees and internally displaced persons, this status will be passed on to them. It's the same for Afghanese refugees. It's the same for Syrian refugees. It's the same for Ukrainian refugees. So we are not the exception in that sense, as Israel likes to portray us to be. It's because our refugee situation is so protracted, the longest standing refugee and IDP population. This is the exception to the rule. And it's Israel that is perpetuating, is making us this exception, not us ourselves. Definitions, any individual who has been forcibly displaced and crosses an internationally recognized border is a refugee under international law. At the time that Israel's legitimacy was recognized in 1948 by the UN and the member states, all Palestinians who left what came to be called Israel and entered into the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, or the surrounding countries, those individuals are considered refugees by international law. If they were forcibly displaced and remained within the entity, they did not cross an internationally recognized border, then they are considered IDPs or internally displaced persons under international law. Both those groups, as forcibly displaced persons, regardless of where they ended up geographically, either outside or inside, have the right to return. And that means without being provided that right, all that group and their descendants are refugees or IDPs under international law. Why is there this denial or these attacks against UNRWA? It's because UNRWA is one of the, I don't want to say symbols, but it's a testament to the existence of a refugee and IDP population that is recognized, very deliberately recognized by the UN, by the international community. UNRWA was created to provide specifically humanitarian aid and assistance to Palestinian refugees and initially also IDPs inside Israel. But Israel pushed UNRWA out of the territory it took over, that 78% of mandatory Palestine by how I explained earlier, how they stripped them of their properties. And now they're attempting to delegitimize UNRWA. And this is a common standard practice for colonial apartheid regimes or colonial apartheid entities. It is necessary to demonize and dehumanize the other so that we can justify, or so that Israel can justify its policies and practices that constitute colonialism and apartheid against the Palestinian people. UNRWA's definition, going back to UNRWA and its specific mandate, it is a humanitarian aid and assistance agency. Initially, it started out providing things like food, clothing, blankets, tents, medicine, water, and so on and so forth. But as the refugee situation became more protracted, it became more of a service delivery type of organization. And the main services that they attempt to provide to Palestinian refugees are healthcare and education, and then social services for extremely marginalized Palestinian refugee populations. Because of the restrictions that have been put on UNRWA, because of fundamental flaws within its mandate, it is struggling regularly to be able to provide those services with any degree of the quantity and quality necessary to deal with or service a growing Palestinian refugee population. Its services are contingent upon need. In other words, UNRWA's definition was a special definition that was created, and this is part of its fundamental structural flaws, to service Palestinian refugees, those who were displaced between 1947 and 1949, I believe, and have a dire need for services. So in other words, very impoverished groups in Palestine. So there were some Palestinian refugees who had capacities, financial capacities, and therefore they weren't registered with UNRWA, but they still constitute refugees under international law. I think that's it. I hope I was clear.
Yes,
it's a lot. It's a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, I know it's quite a lot of information, but thank you. You're very concise. So, so simply making UNRWA disappear is not going to make the refugee issue disappear, much less the refugees themselves.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
Right. And so, Ahlam, I want to turn to you to comment on anything that's been discussed already. But one of the arguments that's being made very often in relation to Palestinian refugees is, look, Israel's never going to allow anything but, even the most optimistic scenario, a symbolic number of refugees to return to what is now Israel. So by calling for a Palestinian right of return, aren't you essentially calling for Israel's destruction? That's one argument that's put forward. And as part of that argument, people say, it's been 75 years, multiple generations now. It's time for these refugees to simply be absorbed into the countries where they now live and where everybody knows they're going to remain for the most part. So what do you say to both of those arguments?
Thank you. And thank you, Lubna, because I think you really paved the way for answering this question. I wanted to go back to Josh's interjection about Truman, but maybe later, so we don't break the nice flow of this conversation. Because, I have to say that Truman, he played a very crucial role, actually, in helping the new state. And actually, what brought me to the United States is my research on Truman and his government's role in the creation of the, not creation, but helping the state of Israel when I did my graduate studies at Deir Zeit University. But to go back to your question, so this question has two parts, I guess, as I see it. So we could talk about the refugees in those countries. And as I said, I'm not the most expert, probably Lebanon would be more expert on this and their status in those host countries, right? But I think the more important part of your question is whether they were settled or not. Does that impact their right of return, right? I think it's a fundamental right, an inalienable right, actually, for the refugees, guaranteed by the United Nations, guaranteed by international law, that like any other dispossessed or any other refugee population in the world, they have this right, fundamental right, to go back to their countries and be compensated, both, not either or, actually. So, I mean, I could talk to you about, how they are settled or not settled in those countries. We could discuss that, and maybe we should. But at the end of the day, I think we have to address that this is a right and should not be compromised, regardless, as Lubna said, of the existence of UNRWA, regardless of their status in the host countries. I mean, many of Palestinian refugees are scattered around the world, but that does not necessarily mean that they lose their right to return, because that was not their choice. Even if they lived nice lives in the United States, in Europe, like a lot of my family, that was not their choice in the first place. Give them the choice, and then it's up to them, to decide, whether they want to be compensated, they want to still live there, or they want to return. So that's one thing. I think it's an issue of principle. The other issue you mentioned is like that would be the end of Israel, that would impact the demographic formation in Israel itself. And I think it's just a ridiculous argument, because there were actually attempts by Palestinian civil society across the world to imagine a free Palestine, to imagine the right of return implemented, the return of the refugees. There were conferences actually over the years, several conferences, that was tasked really with that kind of imagination. How would that look like? And it's actually very doable. It does not necessarily mean that at this point, going back to war or kicking out Jews who came from Europe, etc. And that actually goes back to another important discussion. I think it's very interconnected, whether you think of the two-state solution versus the one-state solution. I don't know if anyone still believes in a two-state solution at this point. Like, for me, it's beyond that. Like, there is no room, there is no any capacity, any imagination of such a solution. So now everything that is happening points to the ultimate solution, which is a one-state solution for everyone. And there were actually attempts to imagine that, and the return of the refugees within such a scenario. And by the way, the land that was taken by the state of Israel from Palestinian, whether it's under the just as a result of the establishment of the state of Israel, or specifically in with specific Israeli laws, like the present absentee law, and the present absentee clause, as Lubna explained actually in details. We know that a lot of that land is not even used. It's still not to a great extent, like the majority of land in Palestine. There is more than room, actually, to absorb all Palestinian refugees if they wish to come back. So I think that's the fundamental question, because I don't want to be, prey to the obfuscation of the Israeli narrative, using all these big words like, oh, it's the end of Israel and it's meant to destroy the state of Israel. Now, if we look at it on the ground at the host countries, so you have Palestinians in Jordan. They actually have, I don't know what they're talking about, because they do have Jordanian citizenship. The majority of Jordanians are actually originally Palestinians, or Palestinian origins. I mean, there is a lot of intermixing, of course. If you look at Syria, the Syrian government from day one actually gave refugees, equal rights, except the citizenship, because that was an in principle, of course, that those have to go to guarantee the right of return. And if we look, I think Lebanon is the more complicated one, but it's not necessarily because it's aimed at Israel, as they say. It's actually this has to do with the complexity of the Lebanese political system, the inter-political system. So it has nothing to do with, trying to destroy Israel or whatever. And as I said, at the end of the day, regardless, I mean, we could talk about those details. Regardless, it's an issue of principle. Refugees have the right to go back and be compensated, both. And before I read, so I'm going back to Truman. So Truman actually, because he knew, of course, the injustice. He acknowledged that secretly. He even called his friend lobbyist, at that time, I can't remember his name, son of a bitch, So he knew what he was doing, but he's at the end of the day a typical politician who was seeking different types of support from the Jewish community at that time that promised him, support in the election. And that's how he operated. What was missed in the conversation is the fact that the United States was the first country to acknowledge the state of Israel only hours after its establishment. And that was actually because of those lobbyists around Truman, who even did not know the name of the state up until they reached the gate of the White House with the Declaration of Independence of Israel. And a secretary actually rushed in a car, stopped them, and they scratched the name. It said, I think, a Jewish state, and then they put Israel. Until the last minute, they didn't even know what the state was called. So I just want to acknowledge that it was intentional, and how can I explain it? It was, regardless also, it's like the support that came, years and years of support. Of course, there were periods like during Eisenhower where things changed a little bit back and forth. But at the end of the day, it was a massive role in supporting the creation of the state of Israel. Sorry if I went too long. Thank you.
No, thanks, Ahlam. Leila, I want to turn to you now. We touched a little bit on the negotiations, or at least we made passing reference. There is this general perception, particularly in Washington, that the refugee issue has been the main stumbling block in previous negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians. Specifically, that the Palestinian insistence on the refugees' right to return was, like I said, this key stumbling block and what caused the various negotiating rounds to collapse. As someone who worked directly on this issue in the negotiations, and full disclosure, Leila and I worked together as advisors to the Palestinian leadership on negotiations. So as someone who's worked on the refugee file in the context of negotiations, how has the issue been dealt with back then in the 2000s? What were the main sticking points to resolving this issue? What was the Palestinian leadership prepared to accept as far as refugees? And how central do you think a resolution to the refugee problem is today to any kind of peace or reconciliation between Israelis and Palestinians?
Thanks, Khalid. I want to first comment on the question of Palestinian exceptionalism, Palestinian refugee exceptionalism, which is, a very important component of thinking about a resolution. The 1951 Refugee Convention, which is a universal convention applying to all refugees and all state responsibilities towards asylum seekers, has a provision which carves out an exception for for any refugee that is receiving protection or assistance from another UN agency. And that was a direct attempt to exclude Palestinian refugees from the Refugee Convention. And notably, the UNHCR, which has the mandate to implement the convention, their mandate includes the search for durable solutions. So, and UNRWA does not have that similar mandate, as has been mentioned. So there's no UN body that can jurisdictionally seek out the right of return with Israel, or resettlement and local integration with the states that within which the majority of refugees are residing. So what is ironic to me about this, about the push towards the elimination of UNRWA, is that if that happened, Palestinian refugees would potentially fall under the 1951 Refugee Convention, and then there would be a UN agency that would be empowered to seek a solution for them outside of this diplomatic realm that we have seen failed to produce a solution to the refugee issue. So that's one point of exceptionalism that I think is important for understanding the situation and potential for durable solutions for Palestinian refugees. And then the second point of exceptionalism is that most refugees in the world are seeking to have asylum in another country because of fear of persecution in their home country. Palestinian refugees, on the other hand, are an exceptionalism because they're seeking to return to their home country. And to think about return, ultimately, it doesn't require significant action beyond opening borders and allowing people to return. So that's a framework of exceptionalism that I wanted to mention and add to what has been spoken. Regarding the negotiations over refugees and sort of the assumption that it's been the main stumbling block, one important thing to note about the Oslo agreements is that it broke down the Palestinian cause into separate issues to be discussed and formulated for resolution on separate tracks. So there were, borders, refugees, economic issues, security, etc. So that fragmented the cause overall. And in that context, the treatment of the right of return and solutions for Palestinians became an operating assumption that the right of return would be leverage for achieving Palestinian statehood. And by leverage, we mean a trading card. So trading the right of return for establishing a sovereign Palestinian state. And that is how the PA really formulated its negotiation position around refugees and around statehood. And I would say that may not be inconsistent with how the majority of Palestinians formulated their own set of interest in a peaceful resolution of the conflict, because sovereignty has always been an important goal of Palestinian cause. So I want to note that and to be sort of upfront and honest about that reality. I think, though, that the notion that the Palestinian claims for the right of return as a main stumbling block is a bit of a misnomer, because even the compromise of a Palestinian state on the 1967 borders, 22% of historic Palestine, between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank that are not even connected by land as being the state. That compromise never produced agreement on the part of Israel to recognize and establish a state. so, you know, it's to me very questionable to say what has been the main stumbling block. But and then just to add that the formulation of the right of the solution for Palestinians has always been to think of return as being to the Palestinian state and to provide an element of compensation. So not the full set of transitional justice elements that we would think about for resolving the refugee question or the broader conflict.
Right, and I want to talk about transitional justice in this next round, which unfortunately is going to have to be a lightning round because we have just around 7 minutes or so left. I think we can go over by a minute or two, but I want to give you guys each an opportunity to talk about where things are today and how they relate to the events of 1948. And so I'm going to start with you, Josh. And because I know you have to duck out early. So we have this new government in Israel. It's the most extreme in Israel's history. We have bona fide extremists and actually convicted terrorists who are in positions of power in this government, including over Palestinian lives. What does this new extremist government in Israel and the growing normalization of extremism in Israel mean for Palestinians in the occupied territories today? There are growing fears, for example, of a second Nakba. What are those fears based on, and what might that look like on the ground? Again, I want to ask everyone to please respond in 2 minutes.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I apologize if I have to leave a little bit before the webinar ends. I have to catch a train. But I think it's important to back up to 1948 for a second to recognize that the mastermind of the expulsion of the Palestinian people, David Ben-Gurion, who is extreme in his actions, was nevertheless very careful in his pronouncements and in what he put down on paper. So he did not put down his plans on paper for the most part. He did not make explicit these ethnic cleansing plans that Israel carried out in 1948 because he was very, very aware of how he would be perceived by the historical record by putting these things into writing. So contrast the extremism of Ben-Gurion's actions in expelling the Palestinian people and his caution in declaring it with the extremism of some of the Israeli ministers today, Bezalel Smotrich, Itamar Ben-Gvir. They say what they mean and they mean what they say. So when you have an Israeli deputy minister in the last government talking about if I could press a button and make all the Palestinians disappear on a train to Switzerland, this is exactly what these ministers want to see. When you have a city councilor in Jerusalem parading through occupied East Jerusalem saying, we want Nakba now, this is exactly what they mean, and this is exactly what they want. And when you have Smotrich himself stand up in the Knesset and scream at Palestinian members of Congress that Ben-Gurion didn't finish the job in 1948 and that you shouldn't even be here today, this is exactly what they want to see. So contrast the extremism of Ben-Gurion's actions with the cautions of his words with the extremism of these pronouncements. These Israeli politicians are outright proud of the fact that they want to expel Palestinians from all of historic Palestine. This is what they want, and it's not at all an overreaction to be concerned that this is what the Israeli government may attempt to implement in the near future. I think you're muted, Khaled.
Sorry. Ahlam, I want to ask you the same basic question about what does 1948 teach us about today? As you said, and as Palestinians always say, the Nakba isn't an event in the past, but is something that is ongoing. Tell us a little bit about that, and what lessons does 1948 provide to Palestinians today, or cautionary tales as well?
Thank you very much. So I think the ongoing Nakba, probably the related to our discussion of the refugee issue, we can go back and revisit one of the military orders that came, after during 1948, which is military order number 40. And that's the military order that made sure that refugees are never allowed to go back, to Palestine. And actually, it was implemented actively, with militarization of the so-called borders at that time, to the extent that even Palestinians who lived only a few miles away as refugees, in the open air, basically, under trees, went back to harvest, to eat, to take some of the fruits, some of the wheat. They would actually prevent them and sometimes even kill them. And that continued, with the destruction of over 500 Palestinian villages and towns, right? Then it continued, of course, with the constant, land theft, and after, of course, 1967, the establishments of settlements or colonies, as I like to call them. I don't like the word settlements again. And it still continues in very, very similar methods. I think what we learned, the most important lesson, that Palestinians, whenever I went to the refugee camps to talk to Palestinians, whether for my research or for my film, was the constant thing is we should have never left. Is this insistent on fighting for your country. And the struggle could take so many different words. I mean, even armed resistance is guaranteed by international law when you have colonization actively happening in your country. And I think that's the important lesson, is to never give up. For the Israeli government, to be honest with you, Palestinians, especially when I go back home, they don't make a lot of distinctions between the Israeli government. I mean, the government that came before Netanyahu last year was the deadliest year for Palestinians since the United Nations started actually collecting information in 2005. Data and statistics on Palestinian casualties. The deadliest year, but nobody talked about that government the same way they are talking about the Netanyahu government now. There were so many, the projects were continuously being done in terms of Sheikh Jarrah, in Jerusalem, in the West Bank, in Gaza. So in a way, I know that might sound weird, but in a way, Palestinians have learned to deal with a very clear enemy, with clear agenda, better than one that is perceived and promoted as pacifist, as, nice, kind, whatever. An enemy is an enemy. This is our colonizer. It doesn't matter how they look. At the end of the day, the policies don't change much. Thank you.
Thanks, Ahlam. Lubna, I want to shift gears a little bit and ask you to talk a little bit about Gaza, because Gaza was again in the news in recent days. There was yet another bombing of Gaza over the past week. At the same time, we know that 70% of Gaza's population are refugees. Gaza is also a place of enormous instability. How central is this refugeehood and refugee experience in Gaza to the kind of instability that we see regularly? And please offer up any final thoughts that you have as well, and then I'll come to Leila to wrap up the discussion.
Okay. Actually, it's higher percentage, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, but that's neither here nor there, because it's quite a large number of Palestinian refugees and their descendants from 1948. The instability in the Gaza Strip is Israeli-made. It's the instability that is there is because of the policies and practices that Israel implements against the Palestinian population in the Gaza Strip. I mean, Ilham spoke to it, this right to resist with any means necessary in any situation where there is a denial of self-determination, particularly through a colonial apartheid regime, a regime that intends to dominate and oppress and control. The right to resist colonial domination and oppression with any means necessary exists under international law. So the population of the Gaza Strip, the Palestinian population of the Gaza Strip, is resisting with the means that they have available to them, and this is legitimate. under international law. And the instability that we see, or the supposed instability, what Israel wants us to believe, Israeli propaganda concerning Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and Hamas, is purely that. It's purely propaganda. I would like to wrap up and say that in the same way that we cannot deny the actual existence and occurrence of the Nakba, we cannot deny the existence of Palestinian refugees and internally displaced persons, we also cannot deny their right of return. And for Palestinians, the right of return is both a collective and individual right, meaning that no one and no entity, even our own leadership, can choose on the issue of return for the Palestinian people. They have to choose themselves whether to return or not to return, or how to engage in their durable solutions. That is for them to choose. The Palestinian right of return is also inalienable, which means that it does not expire and it cannot be changed by anyone under international law. So we cannot deny the Nakba any longer, or we shouldn't at the very least. We also cannot deny the right of return of Palestinian refugees. And they are the ones that need to determine how they exercise that right and be given the opportunity to do so.
Thank you, Lubna. Leila, I want to ask you to wrap up our discussion. As someone who's worked on these issues for many years, you've written about the need to go beyond ordinary peacemaking in favor of kind of a deeper process of reconciliation between these two groups with competing, not just claims, but entirely different historical narratives. Specifically, the idea of transitional justice. What does transitional justice mean? And what does it mean in the Palestinian and Israeli context?
Right. So as I mentioned before, sort of the primary formulation that has been talked about in the context of peace negotiations and resolving the issue of Palestinian refugees is around compensation. But transitional justice is a much broader framework. It starts with the concept of restitution, which is returning a person or people that have suffered wrongs to their original state. In the case of the refugees, we talk about it in terms of property restitution, but also restitution of nationalism, for instance. There's also elements of rehabilitation and satisfaction and compensation. So it's a much broader framework that allows for creative peacemaking because you take into consideration the interest of all the justice interests of the Palestinians, but then also the concerns and needs of Israelis. But I wanted to say that in the context of the sort of conversations I've had with Israelis around refugees and around the whole peacemaking and informal settings, where I've seen Israelis become the most invested and personally concerned about the future is around the issue of reconciliation and seeking out assurances that when the Palestinians are the majority, that the Israelis will continue to have a place of belonging and that they will be forgiven for these historical injustices. And so we've seen in South Africa that the interest of majority rule and a sort of weak truth commission was not enough to overcome the practical discrimination and dispossession of Black South Africans. And so that's how I think about the need to really sort of think about bringing in restitution, rehabilitation, as well as compensation for purposes of something like multi-party negotiations, including civil society, so that we can address this issue of reconciliation and belonging for all, but then also create practical elements to enable refugees, to enable ordinary Palestinians to have a vibrant future under a peace arrangement.
Thanks, Layla, and thanks to all of our audience members especially for sticking around and giving us a little bit more of your time. Thanks especially to our wonderful panelists, Ahlam, Layla, Lubna, and Josh, for a really, really rich and informative discussion. We hope that you also found it useful. And thank you again, and we hope to see you at our next Palestine program event.